English to Success. Your Path to Success.
Chapter 1. Life Before the Revolution. A long time ago, in a country called France, there was a king and a queen who lived in a grand palace. King Louis XVI was the ruler of France, and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, was from a faraway land called Austria. They lived in a beautiful palace called Versailles. The palace had many rooms, gardens filled with flowers, and a lot of gold. The king and queen spent most of their time in this palace, surrounded by luxury and wealth. Everything they wanted, they could have. But while they lived in this world of comfort, many people in France lived in a completely different world. Outside the palace walls, most people were poor. They worked very hard every day, but they didn't have enough money to buy food or pay for the things they needed. Farmers worked on the land, but the land wasn't always kind to them. Sometimes the weather was bad, and their crops didn't grow. When this happened, the people had nothing to eat. Still, they had to pay taxes to the king and the nobles who lived in the palace. These taxes were high, and the people had little left to survive on. King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette didn't seem to notice how difficult life was for the poor people. The king tried to be a good ruler, but he made many mistakes. He spent a lot of money on wars. He thought that these wars would make France stronger, but they only made the country weaker. One of the wars was the American Revolution. King Louis sent soldiers and money to help the American colonists fight against Britain, but this war cost France a lot of money. Queen Marie Antoinette, the king's wife, loved to spend money on clothes and parties. She wore beautiful dresses and had the most fashionable shoes. People often said that she cared more about her appearance than the people of France. They even called her Madame Deficit, because they believed she spent too much money while the country was struggling. Her life of luxury didn't seem to stop, but outside the palace, the people were suffering. Most people in France lived in villages or small towns. They worked hard every day just to make enough money to eat. Farmers planted crops, but the land was not always good. Sometimes the crops didn't grow, and there was not enough food for the people. They were hungry, but they still had to pay taxes to the king and the nobles. They had no choice. Life was hard, and there was little hope. The people of France were divided into three classes. The first class was the king and his family. They lived in luxury and had all the power. The second class was made up of the nobles. These were the rich people who owned land and had power in the country. The third class was the common people. These were the farmers, workers, and families who had no money or power. The common people were the largest group, but they had the least amount of wealth. The king and his family lived in their grand palace, while the poor people lived in small, simple homes. They worked hard, but had little money to spend. They had to worry about the next day, the next meal. The rich people, on the other hand, lived in big houses, wore fine clothes, and went to expensive parties. They didn't understand the struggles of the poor people. King Louis XVI continued to spend money on wars, and soon France was in deep debt. The country owed a lot of money, and the people had to help pay it off. They were already poor, but now they were being asked to give even more money. The taxes became higher, and the people grew more and more upset. They felt that the king and queen didn't care about them at all. The king didn't know how to solve the country's problems, and his people were angry. The people in France began to talk more about the king's mistakes. They saw that the country was falling apart. Many people were hungry and upset, and they wanted change. The idea of a revolution started to spread. The revolutionaries wanted to create a new France, one where the people could be equal and have a say in how the country was run. They dreamed of a country where no one would be forced to live in poverty, while the king and queen lived in luxury. The people began to meet in secret. They talked about their hopes for a better life, a life where they could share the wealth and power. They talked about the need for change, but they didn't know how to make it happen. They were tired of seeing their children suffer from hunger, tired of working all day for little money, and tired of paying high taxes. At the same time, King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette continued their life in the palace, unaware of the anger and frustration growing outside. The poor people of France were beginning to realize that something had to change. They could not continue living like this. Something was about to happen, something that would change the future of France forever. Chapter 2: The Start of the Revolution. As the days passed, the people of France grew more desperate. They could no longer ignore the fact that their lives were hard, and the rich lived in luxury without any care for them. The poor farmers, workers, and families wanted change. They were ready to do whatever it took to make their voices heard. In the year 1789, something very important happened. The king, King Louis XVI, called a meeting called the Estates General. This was a meeting where the three classes of people in France would come together to discuss the country's problems. The king hoped that the meeting would help solve the country's debt and fix the problems. But the common people, the poor, had different ideas. The meeting was held in a big room, and the king expected everyone to listen to him. He thought the nobles and the clergy, the rich people, would agree with his ideas. But the common people, who were called the Third Estate, had their own plans. They were tired of being treated like they didn't matter. They wanted to have a say in how the country was run. The Third Estate was the largest group, and they realized that they were the most important. They began to speak up. They said, "We should have the same power as the king and the nobles. We are the ones who work hard every day to keep the country running. Without us, the country would not function." The king did not like what he was hearing. He thought that the Third Estate was too bold. He didn't want to share power with them. So, he sent them away. But the people refused to leave. They gathered in a nearby tennis court and swore an oath. They promised that they would not stop fighting for their rights until they had a say in how the country was run. This oath became known as the Tennis Court Oath. The people of the Third Estate were determined to change things. They didn't care about the king's orders. They knew that they had to act, or nothing would ever change. They began to organize and meet in secret to plan what to do next. At the same time, the country was facing more problems. The crops were bad, and the food prices were rising. People couldn't afford to buy bread, which was the main food for most families. The poor people were hungry, and the anger was building. In Paris, the situation was getting worse. People started to protest in the streets. They were demanding food, and they were demanding change. On July 14th, 1789, the people of Paris took action. They stormed the Bastille, a large prison in the center of the city. The Bastille was a symbol of the king's power. The people wanted to show that they were no longer afraid. They wanted to show that they were strong and that they would not be controlled anymore. They fought the soldiers guarding the Bastille, and after hours of fighting, they broke through the gates. They freed the prisoners and took control of the Bastille. This was the beginning of the revolution. The storming of the Bastille became a symbol of the people's strength and desire for change. The news spread quickly throughout France, and soon people in other cities joined the revolution. They wanted to end the old system and build a new one. The king and queen were shocked by what had happened. They couldn't believe that the people had taken control of the Bastille. They realized that they could no longer ignore the anger of the people. The revolution had begun, and there was no going back. The National Assembly, the group of people who had sworn the tennis court oath, began to work on new laws to give the people more power. They wanted to create a country where everyone was equal, where the king no longer had all the power. They took away some of the privileges that the nobles and the church had, and they started to create a new government. But the king was not ready to give up his power. He did not want to lose his throne, and he tried to fight back. He didn't want to share his wealth or control with anyone else. But the people were strong, and they were not going to stop until they had what they wanted. As the revolution continued, things got more and more difficult. The people were fighting not just for food, but for their rights. They wanted a say in their government, and they were willing to risk everything to get it. The country was changing, and no one knew what would happen next. But one thing was clear: the old ways were gone, and a new France was on the horizon. Chapter 3: The Fall of the Monarchy. As the revolution grew stronger, King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette realized that the power they once held was slipping away. The people of France were no longer willing to accept their rule, and the changes that the National Assembly had started to make were gaining more support. But the king was not ready to give up without a fight. He believed that he was chosen by God to rule, and he could not imagine a life without his power. However, the people of France were determined to make sure that their voices were heard, and they were not willing to let the king continue to live in luxury while they struggled. In October 1789, a group of angry women from Paris marched to Versailles. They were upset because they could not afford food, and the king's palace in Versailles seemed like a symbol of everything that was wrong with the country. The women wanted to show their anger, so they marched to Versailles, demanding that the king and queen come back to Paris. They believed that the king should live with the people and see the suffering they had to endure every day. The march was large and full of energy. The women were determined to make the king see their pain. When they arrived at the palace, they confronted King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. They demanded that the royal family return to Paris and live in the heart of the city, where they would be closer to the people. King Louis reluctantly agreed, and the royal family was forced to leave Versailles and move to the Tuileries Palace in Paris. This was a significant moment in the revolution. It was the first time that the people had been able to force the king and queen to do something they didn't want to do. The move to Paris meant that the monarchy was no longer safe in Versailles. The royal family was now under the watchful eyes of the people, and the power of the revolution was growing stronger. As the royal family settled into their new home in Paris, the situation became even more difficult. The National Assembly continued to create new laws to limit the power of the king. They declared that France would no longer be a monarchy. Instead, they wanted to create a government based on the people's will, where everyone would be equal. They passed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which said that all people had the right to liberty, property, and freedom from oppression. The king was not happy about these changes. He still believed in the old ways and wanted to regain control. In June 1791, he and his family decided to escape from Paris. They thought they could flee to a nearby country and get help from other monarchies. They believed that if they could escape, they could start a counter-revolution and bring back the old system of government. The royal family tried to leave the city in secret, but their plan failed. As they tried to leave Paris and make their way to the town of Varennes, they were recognized by a soldier who knew who they were. The soldier stopped them and sent word to Paris that the royal family was trying to escape. Soon, the royal family was arrested and brought back to the city. The people of Paris were furious when they learned that the king had tried to leave. They felt betrayed by their king, who had once promised to listen to them. The king's escape attempt was a turning point in the revolution. It made it clear to the people that King Louis XVI was not on their side. They no longer believed that he cared about their suffering. The people wanted change, and they were not going to stop until they got it. In 1792, the revolution reached its peak. The monarchy was officially abolished, and the king and queen were put on trial. They were found guilty of treason and plotting against the revolution. King Louis XVI was sentenced to death by guillotine. On January 21st, 1793, he was executed in front of a large crowd in the Place de la Révolution in Paris. The people cheered as the king's head was cut off. It was a shocking moment, and it marked the end of the monarchy in France. Queen Marie Antoinette was also put on trial. She was accused of many things, including spending too much money and betraying the people of France. In October 1793, she was executed in the same way as her husband. Her death was a symbol of the complete fall of the monarchy and the power of the revolution. The execution of the king and queen was a turning point for France. The revolution had succeeded in removing the monarchy, but what would come next? The people had wanted freedom and equality, but now they had to figure out how to build a new country. The road ahead was uncertain, and the revolution was far from over. But the fall of the monarchy was a powerful symbol of the people's strength and their determination to create a new France, one where everyone would have a voice. Chapter 4: The Reign of Terror. With the monarchy gone, the revolution entered a new and dangerous phase. The people had won their battle against King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, but the country was now in chaos. France was surrounded by enemies who wanted to stop the revolution. Countries like Austria, Prussia, and Great Britain were all afraid that the ideas of the revolution would spread to their own people. They did not want to see more monarchs overthrown. At the same time, the revolutionaries in France were divided. Some people wanted to create a government based on democracy, where everyone could have a say. Others, however, believed that the revolution needed strong leadership to protect it. These differences led to a violent struggle for power. The leaders of the revolution became more extreme in their efforts to defend the new republic. In 1793, a group called the Jacobins took control of the revolution. They were led by a man named Maximilien Robespierre, a lawyer who believed that the revolution must be protected at all costs. Robespierre and his supporters were willing to do anything, even kill, to protect the new republic and stop anyone who might try to return to the old ways. To make sure that their enemies were silenced, the Jacobins created the Committee of Public Safety. This committee had one goal: to protect the revolution from both internal and external enemies. However, their methods were brutal. They believed that the only way to stop enemies of the revolution was through terror. The most famous method of execution during this time was the guillotine, a large machine with a sharp blade that quickly and cleanly cut off a person's head. During the Reign of Terror, the guillotine became a symbol of fear and death. The people who were executed included royalists, priests, nobles, and anyone who spoke out against the revolution. Even people who were once friends of the revolution were accused of being traitors and sent to the guillotine. One of the most famous people to be executed was Marie Antoinette, the former queen. She had already been in prison for months, but in October 1793, she was put on trial and found guilty of treason. She was dragged to the guillotine in front of a large crowd, who watched as she was executed. Her death was a symbol of the complete end of the old order in France. Robespierre believed that the use of terror was necessary to keep the revolution alive. He said, "Terror is nothing else than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible." He thought that by removing all the enemies of the revolution, the country could become a perfect society. But as the Reign of Terror went on, more and more people began to fear for their lives. Anyone could be accused of being a traitor, and once accused, it was very hard to avoid death. Even Robespierre, the leader of the Reign of Terror, eventually became a target. In 1794, people started to turn against him. They feared that Robespierre was becoming too powerful and that he would continue to use terror to control the country. In July 1794, Robespierre was arrested and sent to the guillotine. His execution marked the end of the Reign of Terror, but it did not end the turmoil in France. Although Robespierre was dead, the fear and violence of the Reign of Terror left a lasting mark on France. The country was still in chaos, and the people were unsure of what would come next. The revolution had overthrown the monarchy, but it had also created a government based on fear and violence. The path forward was uncertain, and many people in France were beginning to wonder if the revolution had gone too far. The Reign of Terror was a dark time in the history of the French Revolution. It showed how the desire for change can turn into violence, and how fear can be used to control people. The leaders of the revolution had wanted to create a fair and equal society, but instead, they had created a government that used terror to stay in power. The revolution had changed France, but it had also left the people questioning whether the price of freedom was too high. Chapter 5: The Rise of Napoleon. After the fall of Robespierre and the end of the Reign of Terror, France was still in a state of chaos. The country had gone through years of violence, and the people were tired. The revolution had promised equality and freedom, but what had it really brought? The economy was in shambles, and the government was weak. There was no clear leader to unite the people or bring stability to the nation. In the midst of this confusion, one man emerged who would change the course of French history forever. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon was born in Corsica, an island in the Mediterranean, in 1769. He came from a poor family, but he was very smart and ambitious. He was sent to mainland France to study at military school, where he quickly rose to the top of his class. As a young officer, he was known for his courage, intelligence, and ability to inspire his soldiers. He had a deep understanding of military strategy, which would later make him one of the greatest generals in history. When the revolution broke out in 1789, Napoleon saw it as an opportunity to rise in the ranks. He was loyal to the ideas of the revolution, but he also understood that the country needed strong leadership to recover from the chaos. He quickly made a name for himself as a leader in the French army, showing great skill during battles and gaining the respect of his soldiers. In 1799, France was still struggling. The government, called the Directory, was weak and corrupt. It was unable to solve the country's problems, and many people lost faith in it. The economy was failing, and the wars with other countries seemed endless. People were looking for a solution, and Napoleon saw his chance. In November of 1799, Napoleon staged a coup d'etat, a sudden and forceful takeover of the government. He claimed that the Directory had failed and that it was time for a new government. Napoleon took control of the country, and soon after, he became the first consul of France, a position with nearly absolute power. Napoleon promised to restore order to France. He brought stability to the country, fixed the economy, and ended the wars that had torn France apart. He was a hero to many people, especially the soldiers who admired his leadership and victories. Napoleon was determined to make France a powerful nation, and he believed that he was the one who could lead it to greatness. In 1804, Napoleon took another big step. He declared himself Emperor of the French. This was a bold move, as it meant that he was not just a leader of France, but the ruler of an empire. Napoleon believed that he was destined for greatness, and he saw himself as the ruler of a new France, one that would be strong and respected by the rest of Europe. As emperor, Napoleon worked hard to improve France. He created a new set of laws called the Napoleonic Code, which became the foundation for many legal systems around the world. The code guaranteed certain rights to citizens, such as the right to property and the right to a fair trial. Napoleon also made important changes to education, the economy, and the military, which helped strengthen the country. One of the biggest achievements of Napoleon's reign was his success in war. He led France to victory in several important battles, and by 1812 he controlled much of Europe. His empire stretched from Spain in the west to Russia in the east. Napoleon had achieved what few leaders could ever dream of. He had created a powerful empire that ruled over most of Europe. But Napoleon's success came at a cost. His empire was built on war, and the constant fighting took a toll on France and its people. Many of the countries that Napoleon had conquered were not happy with his rule, and they began to fight back. The wars he started drained France's resources, and the people began to grow weary of the constant conflict. In 1812, Napoleon made a crucial mistake. He decided to invade Russia, hoping to expand his empire even further. But the Russian winter was harsh, and Napoleon's army was unprepared for the conditions. Many soldiers died from the cold, and the invasion ended in disaster. This marked the beginning of Napoleon's downfall. After the failure in Russia, other European countries saw an opportunity to defeat Napoleon. They joined forces and began to push back against his empire. In 1814, the coalition of countries defeated Napoleon's army, and he was forced to abdicate or give up the throne. He was exiled to the small island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. Napoleon's reign had come to an end, but his story was far from over. In 1815, he escaped from Elba and returned to France for a brief period known as the 100 Days. He regained control of the country, but his return was short-lived. The European powers quickly united against him, and in June 1815, Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. This was his final defeat, and he was exiled again, this time to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic Ocean, where he would spend the rest of his life. Napoleon died in 1821, but his legacy lived on. He had changed France and Europe forever. His rise to power and his fall from grace showed both the greatness and the dangers of ambition. Napoleon remains one of the most famous and controversial figures in history. He is remembered for his military genius, his ability to lead, and his impact on the world. Chapter 6: The End of the Revolution and the Legacy of Napoleon. Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo marked the end of an era for France. After his final exile to St. Helena, the Revolution, which had begun with such hope and excitement, seemed to be over. France had gone through a period of great change, from the overthrow of the monarchy to the rise of Napoleon's empire. But now the country was in need of healing. The Revolution's ideals, liberty, equality, and fraternity, had been challenged and reshaped by years of war, violence, and political turmoil. In the years following Napoleon's downfall, the Bourbon monarchy was restored. Louis XVIII, the brother of the executed king, Louis XVI, became the King of France. But the French people had changed during the Revolution. They had tasted freedom, and they were not willing to go back to the old ways of absolute monarchy. Louis XVIII ruled France in a more limited way than his ancestors had, but he still faced much opposition. Many people, especially those who had supported Napoleon, were unhappy with the return of the monarchy. They wanted to see France continue as a republic, or they hoped for a leader who could bring stability and greatness, just as Napoleon had. While the monarchy had been restored, the ideals of the French Revolution remained. The idea that all men should be equal under the law, that people had the right to determine their own government, and that monarchs should not have absolute power continued to influence France. These ideas spread throughout Europe and the world, inspiring many other revolutions and political changes. The French Revolution had sparked a wave of change, and its ideas lived on even after the revolution itself had ended. Napoleon, too, left behind a legacy that continued to shape Europe. Although his empire had fallen, the reforms he had made in France remained. One of his greatest achievements was the Napoleonic Code, a set of laws that guaranteed equality for all men and established clear rules for property, contracts, and individual rights. The Napoleonic Code became the basis for many legal systems around the world, and it continues to influence legal systems today. Napoleon also changed the way people thought about government and leadership. He proved that a leader could come from humble beginnings and rise to the top, not through birthright, but through talent, ambition, and hard work. His rise to power was a symbol of the changes that the Revolution had brought to France. The idea that anyone, regardless of their background, could achieve greatness. His reign also showed the dangers of absolute power and the cost of war. Napoleon's ambitions had led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, and his empire had been built on bloodshed. The Congress of Vienna, held in 1814 and 1815 after Napoleon's defeat, was an attempt by European powers to restore order to Europe. The Congress sought to undo the changes Napoleon had made and return Europe to a system of monarchies. But the ideas of the Revolution could not be erased so easily. Even though the monarchy was restored in France, the spirit of the Revolution lived on in the hearts of the people. The French Revolution had inspired revolutions in many other countries, and it continued to influence political movements around the world. In the years following the Revolution, France experienced more turmoil. In 1830, another revolution broke out, leading to the end of the Bourbon monarchy and the rise of a new king, Louis Philippe, who ruled as a constitutional monarch. The revolution's ideas of democracy and liberty would continue to inspire change in France and across Europe for many years. The story of the French Revolution and the rise and fall of Napoleon shows how deeply the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity changed the world. The Revolution and Napoleon's empire were both periods of great change and great violence, but they left behind a legacy that shaped the modern world. The ideas of the Revolution and the example of Napoleon's rise from obscurity to power would continue to inspire people around the world to fight for freedom, equality, and justice. The revolution had ended in a way no one could have predicted. It had brought an end to the old monarchy, created a republic, and eventually led to the rise of Napoleon as emperor. Napoleon's downfall was a result of his ambition and the cost of his wars, but his reforms and his impact on France and Europe lived on. The revolution itself had led to great change, but it also left many questions unanswered. Would France ever find true stability? Would the ideas of the revolution continue to inspire future generations? The answers to these questions would be shaped by the people of France and the world for years to come. As the years passed, the revolution remained a symbol of both the power of the people and the dangers of unchecked ambition. It showed that change is possible, but that it often comes with great cost. The story of the French Revolution is one of hope, fear, ambition, and sacrifice, a story that continues to resonate with people around the world who seek freedom and equality. Chapter 7: Napoleon becomes emperor. After years of war and revolution, France found itself in turmoil. The French Revolution had brought down the old monarchy, but it also left the country in chaos. The people had fought for freedom, equality, and the end of royal power, but they were now faced with uncertainty. Many feared that without a strong leader, the country would collapse. Into this uncertain world stepped Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who had already shown his brilliance as a military commander and leader. Born on the island of Corsica in 1769, Napoleon was raised in a family of Italian descent that had recently moved to the island. He received an education in mainland France and quickly rose through the ranks of the French army. His talent for military strategy became apparent during the French Revolution, when he made a name for himself leading France's army against foreign invaders and political rivals. His victories in battles such as Toulon and the Italian campaign earned him a reputation as one of the most gifted military leaders in Europe. By 1799, Napoleon was already a national hero, and his rise to power seemed unstoppable. France was struggling with instability after the Revolution, and the country was weak from years of warfare. Napoleon, sensing the opportunity, led a coup d'état, overthrowing the government and establishing himself as the first consul. He promised to restore order and protect the gains of the revolution. However, as he began to consolidate his power, his true ambitions became clearer. Napoleon wanted not just to be a leader, he wanted to be emperor. In 1804, after 5 years as first consul, Napoleon declared himself emperor of the French. The French Revolution had abolished the monarchy, but Napoleon argued that his rule would be different. Unlike the old kings, he claimed, his power came directly from the people, and he would work to preserve the revolutionary principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Many people were skeptical of this, but they were also drawn to the idea of a strong, stable leader who could end the chaos. The coronation ceremony, held in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, was a spectacle. Napoleon was crowned in front of thousands of people, but in a surprising move, he took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. This dramatic gesture symbolized his belief that he owed nothing to the church or any higher authority. He was the ultimate ruler, and no one could challenge his power. Napoleon's first years as emperor were marked by reform. He worked to stabilize the French economy, introduce new legal codes, and build infrastructure across the country. The Napoleonic Code, a new set of laws, was one of his most important achievements. It granted equality under the law, protected private property, and ensured civil rights for men. However, the code also limited some freedoms, particularly for women, and gave Napoleon the power to govern without the interference of others. Despite his many reforms, Napoleon's rule was not without controversy. His expansionist ambitions, especially his desire to create a European empire, began to worry other countries. Napoleon's rise to power was not just about restoring order to France, it was about establishing his dominance over all of Europe. In 1805, Napoleon's army faced off against a coalition of European powers in the Battle of Austerlitz. This battle, sometimes called the Battle of the Three Emperors, is considered one of Napoleon's greatest victories. His forces defeated the armies of Russia, Austria, and other nations, cementing his position as the most powerful leader in Europe. However, the more Napoleon expanded his empire, the more enemies he made. The French emperor's ambition led him to challenge the old powers of Europe, which would eventually set the stage for his fall. Yet at this point, Napoleon was at the height of his power. He had reshaped the political landscape of Europe and left an indelible mark on France's history. Chapter 8: Napoleon's Wars Across Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte's military genius was at the heart of his empire building. His campaigns and wars changed the political and military landscape of Europe forever. The Napoleonic Wars were a series of conflicts fought between Napoleon's French Empire and various coalitions of European powers. Napoleon's vision was to create a unified French-dominated Europe, but not everyone shared his dream. His military strategies, though brilliant, led to an escalating cycle of wars that would have devastating consequences. Napoleon's Grande Armée was one of the most formidable military forces ever assembled. Napoleon's tactics, especially his ability to move quickly and strike hard, gave his army a major advantage over his enemies. In 1805, he achieved a major victory at Austerlitz, where he decisively defeated the combined forces of Austria and Russia. This victory led to the signing of the Treaty of Pressburg, which significantly weakened Austria's influence in Europe and increased Napoleon's power. Following his victory at Austerlitz, Napoleon turned his attention to Britain, his most persistent enemy. Although he had defeated many of Europe's land armies, Napoleon's forces were unable to overcome Britain's control of the seas. This struggle led to the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, a naval clash between the British Navy, led by Admiral Horatio Nelson, and the combined fleets of France and Spain. The battle was a disastrous defeat for Napoleon, and it ensured that Britain would remain a powerful enemy. Undeterred by this setback, Napoleon focused on expanding his empire on land. He invaded Spain and Portugal in 1808, hoping to spread his influence to the Iberian Peninsula. This conflict, known as the Peninsular War, was one of the most difficult campaigns of Napoleon's career. Despite initial successes, Napoleon was unable to fully conquer Spain and Portugal. The Spanish guerrillas fought fiercely against the French occupation, and the British, under the leadership of Wellington, provided support to the rebels. The Peninsular War drained Napoleon's resources and weakened his army, setting the stage for future problems. Meanwhile, Napoleon continued his conquests in Eastern Europe. In 1812, he launched an ambitious invasion of Russia, a campaign that would prove to be a disastrous mistake. The Russian army, led by Tsar Alexander I, used a strategy known as scorched earth, burning crops and destroying resources as they retreated. Napoleon's army, facing starvation and the brutal Russian winter, was decimated during the retreat from Moscow. The Russian campaign marked the beginning of Napoleon's downfall. While his empire had seemed invincible, the failure to conquer Russia shattered Napoleon's confidence and weakened his forces. Over the next few years, the French emperor faced an increasingly united Europe, with Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria forming coalitions against him. Chapter 9: Napoleon's Downfall. Napoleon's downfall came slowly but inevitably, as the forces arrayed against him began to close in. His disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 was a turning point. After his retreat from Moscow, Napoleon's once mighty Grande Armée was in tatters. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had been lost, and the French Empire began to unravel. By 1814, Napoleon's enemies had gathered enough strength to launch a final assault on France. The Sixth Coalition, which included Britain, Russia, Prussia, Spain, and Austria, marched into France, defeating Napoleon's forces in a series of battles. The Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations, in 1813, was a particularly crushing defeat for Napoleon. His forces were outnumbered and outgunned, and they were forced to retreat. The coalition armies entered Paris in March 1814, and Napoleon was forced to abdicate. He was exiled to the island of Elba, a small Mediterranean island off the coast of Italy. Napoleon's abdication was a bitter moment for him. He had been at the height of his power just a few years earlier, but now he was a prisoner of his own ambition. The Treaty of Paris, signed in May 1814, formally ended the war and saw Napoleon removed from power. However, Napoleon's exile was not to be permanent. In 1815, just under a year after his abdication, Napoleon escaped from Elba and returned to France. His return sparked a brief but intense period known as the 100 Days, during which Napoleon tried to regain his power. Napoleon quickly gathered an army and marched on Paris, where he was welcomed by many who remembered his earlier successes. But Europe was not willing to let him return to the throne. The Seventh Coalition, which included Britain, Prussia, and other European powers, mobilized to stop him. The Battle of Waterloo, fought in June 1815, was Napoleon's final defeat. His forces were decisively beaten by a combined British and Prussian army. Napoleon was captured and sent into exile once again, this time to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. There, he lived for the remaining years of his life, far from the empire he had built and lost. Chapter 10: The Legacy of the French Revolution and Napoleon. Napoleon's downfall did not erase the changes he had brought to Europe. In fact, his legacy is still felt today, not just in France, but across the world. The French Revolution had already shown that it was possible to overthrow the old systems of monarchy and aristocracy, but Napoleon's reign took these ideas even further. Napoleon's Napoleonic Code, which he created in 1804, became one of his most important and lasting contributions. The code established the principles of equality before the law, protection of property rights, and the idea that laws should be clear and applied uniformly. These principles influenced legal systems across Europe, and many countries, including Italy, Germany, and even Latin America, adopted elements of the code in their own legal systems. Napoleon's rule also spread the ideals of the French Revolution across Europe. Under Napoleon's empire, feudal systems were abolished, and many nations adopted modern administrative systems. Napoleon's influence helped pave the way for nationalism to grow in Europe, as people began to identify more with their nations and less with local lords and monarchs. Yet Napoleon's wars were also a source of immense destruction. The Napoleonic Wars caused millions of deaths and disrupted the lives of countless people. In France, Napoleon's wars drained the economy and caused immense hardship. But for many, the end justified the means. The rise of democratic ideals, the spread of republican values, and the establishment of more egalitarian systems were seen as victories of the Revolution. Today, historians continue to debate Napoleon's legacy. Was he a champion of the people, a reformer who brought stability and modernization to France and Europe? Or was he a dictator, driven by personal ambition and power, whose wars led to widespread suffering? Regardless of the answer, there is no doubt that Napoleon shaped the course of history in profound and lasting ways.